Welcome to friends, colleagues. I think it's a wise spiritual practice to begin with gratitude, and so I have some quick thanks. I just want to, first of all, thank Harriet and Mark and Beit, because it saved my life. And exactly as Harriet said, I learned here that I could be all of me in a way that I never thought I could be. And I never thought I could be truly happy being all of me, and here I learned to reclaim the contentment of life as living as a human being, a whole human being, a rabbi, and everything else that I am. I want to acknowledge Stuart Matlins is here, who's the head of Jewish Lights. Jewish Lights may be the most important and popular publishing house of Jewish books in English around the world, and there have been so many significant contributions. I'm just so grateful that you and Jewish Lights have included recovery as a really important part of the work that you do in bringing recovery to Jews who need it, because Jews are alcoholics and addicts too. I want to also, I'm grateful that the residents who are here, I have the honor of being a spiritual counselor and teaching Torah to the residents, and every day they remind me who I am, and you really were the ones that permitted me to come out as a whole person, and I want to dedicate tonight to you, so thank you, residents. I have a lot of friends who are here. Thank you for being here. Cantor Herschel Fox is here, my cantor. And my teachers are here, and I've been so blessed to have so many wonderful teachers. Rabbi Mimi Feigelson, I don't know where she went, is here. There she is. Thank you so much for your love and support. And of course, my teacher, Rabbi Artson. And just a quick story about Rabbi Artson. First of all, this book never would have happened without Rabbi Artson. I wrote it and showed it to some people, and then I showed it to him. And I said, you know, I think I have a book here. And he was immediately supportive and sent it to Stuart and got the wheels turning. But very quickly, this is the kind of rabbi and teacher Rabbi Artson is. I don't know if you remember this, but the day that I got told that I needed to go to rehab when I was intervened, I called Rabbi Artson. I had been talking to him about something else, and I called him. It was a Friday. Called him on his cell phone, and he was in his car. And I said, Rabbi Artson, I'm an alcoholic and I have to go to rehab. And his answer, he paused, the very rabbinic pause, and he said, is this a joke? And then he went on to tell me that he would have my back no matter what. And that was a very liberating and relieving response, and I really appreciate it. It carried me through a lot of tough days, so thank you. This book began as an assignment at Beit Tshuva. When I was in the house, we had peer counseling, where we would talk to a chaver, a friend who had been in the house for some time. And one of the first assignments on the peer counseling was to write your story. I had to write my story and include my addiction, my alcoholism, my using, whatever. And as I was writing my story, I realized that something was off. It was just something doesn't fit. And the piece that didn't fit was my Judaism. I didn't know how to write my Judaism into my story. And stories are a very interesting thing. I mean, we're told from a very young age about our story. Parents tell us our story. This is who you are. This is where you come from. Teachers tell us our story. This is what you're good at. This is who you are. This is what you can become. Society tells us our story. As Americans, as citizens, the media tells us our story, tell all the stuff that we need in order to be happy. Commercials, consumerism. We're told all the time who we are in our story. And the truth is that we're all of those things and none of those things. And the ancient spiritual practice of reclaiming our story is really a profound exercise. And I think that's one of the reasons that we have it. And it's also one of the core principles of Alcoholics Anonymous. We go to meetings, and what do? We tell our stories, and we listen to other stories. And in the process of telling our stories, we hear our own stories, and they're reflected back to us in a trusting community. And the more and more we tell our story, the more it becomes refined and clear as to who we are in the world. We have to be able to tell our story. And I couldn't really fit Judaism in. I didn't know how to do it. And especially, being a rabbi, which is supposed to represent the epitome of what a Jew is supposed to be. I didn't know many Jews who were addicts or alcoholics, certainly not rabbis. Today I know many more, but I didn't know then. Judaism represented something that was pure to me, something that was sacred, something that was aspirational, but I didn't feel pure. I certainly didn't feel pure when I was writing it. I didn't feel connected to it. I didn't feel worthy. And so this book then became a response to that question. How can I integrate my Judaism, which I thought was pure, into who I am, which is a little unclear, a little muddy, a little gray, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And the key for me, frankly, what made it possible to integrate it was Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. Because AA is a program of recovery based upon spiritual principles. Well, Judaism is a program based upon spiritual principles. So instead of looking at the big book in AA as something that was different, that was not Jewish, I began to read it differently. I began to read it as a Jewish book. And I could begin to see the correlations. And so what began as my story then began my sort of dissertation on Jewish spirituality and how that plays into AA. And that was a very freeing thing for me. Now, I had to go back. What was it to become a rabbi? Now, I always felt a little different in rabbinical school. I always felt like I didn't totally fit in, which I know a lot of people can relate to. I felt kind of like a fraud, like I'm not worthy, because I was told a story of what a rabbi was supposed to be. A rabbi is a symbolic exemplar. And it was okay because there was a bunch of other people who I didn't think were necessarily smarter or better than me around me. But I did feel different. I felt like some of them knew more about what it meant to be Jewish than me. And so I kind of found my own area to be different. I dressed maybe sometimes a little differently. Like I was the guy in rabbinical school who would show up in flip-flops and shorts, or, basketball shoes and shorts and a ratty t-shirt, or I wore ratty flannel shirts, and I'd wear a baseball cap real pulled down like this, or baseball cap backwards, and not a lot of my friends and classmates did that. They were dressing up the part. They had internships. Just a quick story about that, which is sort of emblematic. One day I was sitting on the second floor of the rabbinical school, and I was studying outside. It was 4 or 5 o'clock, and I was sitting there studying outside, and one of my professors walked up to me as I was out there. My professor was Dr. Pinchas Giller, okay? And he is one of the most renowned scholars of Jewish mysticism. He's an Orthodox rabbi, taught in the conservative rabbinical school, and very knowledgeable, knows way more than I'll never, ever know about Judaism. And what you have to know about Dr. Giller is that he also had a past as kind of like an alternative guy, kind of like a hippie. And that particular day, he doesn't dress like this every day. That particular day, he happened to be wearing, along with his kippah, a black Grateful Dead t-shirt, and black jeans, and black boots. And there I was in my ratty flannel shirt with my baseball cap turned backwards. I don't even think I had a kippah on underneath. And I'm talking to him in shorts, and we're shooting the breeze. And a rabbi, there was a chapel on the second floor where sacred moments would happen. And a rabbi runs out of there. It was Rabbi Neil Weinberg, who was doing life cycle events. And he runs on and says, I'm doing a get. I'm doing a divorce, and I need witnesses for the get. And we're standing there. We look at each other. Okay, and we go in there. And they're in the chapel, and it's a Persian family. It's very formal. Everybody's dressed up, 3-piece suits, and we're like, oh, my God. And Rabbi Weinberg begins to do whatever. I couldn't even pay attention. I was mortified. And at one point, he said he wants to read the get in Aramaic. And he says, Dr. Giller, you're the biggest scholar in the room. You should read the get out loud. And so Dr. Giller reads the get. And I can tell he's also feeling a little awkward in the moment. And we somehow managed to get through this moment, and we both sort of, it ends, we both sort of walk out the door together, shoulder to shoulder, looking down. Didn't say anything, and we walk about 10 steps out, and he said, see what you learned today? You can never dress down. Sort of emblematic of what a rabbi is supposed to be, right? So I always felt different. I always felt a little bit like I was a fraud, and that insecurity. We know this is what insecurity and fear does. I projected it in resentment toward others. I became judgmental. I would sometimes look at my rabbinic student colleagues, and I would look at them in their past, which I didn't have. Many of them grew up in Jewish day schools, went to Hebrew school. They went to U.S. youth group. They went to Jewish camp. I didn't do all those things, and I would judge them for it. I would say to myself, it's a cookie-cutter rabbi. It's a cookie-cutter. He's gone through the movement. He's gone through all this, but I have a different kind of past. I wasn't exactly like that. I was different. And even though they might have had social access, they knew people, they knew Jewish institutions, they knew how things worked, I had one thing, I could outwork them. They might know more, but I could outwork them. I could outlearn them. I could read more, I could write more, I could perform better. And then one day we had a seminar, and a well-known rabbi, Rabbi David Wolpe from Sinai Temple, came to speak to rabbinic students. And the question was, what is a rabbi? There's all sorts of different opinions about what a rabbi does. Does a rabbi make decisions about Jewish law? That's one opinion. Rabbi Wolpe said that a rabbi is a generalist. Generalist. We don't have to be experts in any one particular thing. We just have to have a broad perspective of knowledge and be able to speak to most things, but not necessarily become expert. But in my insecurity and my feeling of fraudulence, what I heard was, I have to be excellent at everything if I want to be legitimate. And so I felt like I had to be an excellent in scholarship, excellent in preaching and teaching and pastoring and spiritual counseling and in the camp setting. And I worked really hard. And it was kind of painful. The blessing was that I had an amazing rabbinical school education. I really felt like I had the best rabbinical school education. I learned a ton. I got a ton out of it. I saved everything. I taught everything I learned. But it was a tough going, and I was holding this inside. I really didn't feel like other people were sharing this experience. So then I went into the rabbinate, and I was hit with something I knew was going to happen, but I didn't know it. I knew that I was going to be the symbolic example. I wasn't going to be just another guy in a class with fellow students who were all going through something. I was now alone. I was the rabbi. My classmates weren't there. My rabbi wasn't there. My community wasn't there. And what I experienced in being the symbolic exemplar was an inherent feeling of loneliness. And I want to break that down in a couple of ways. The first thing in the loneliness was in my decision-making. You make the decisions about policies. I was the principal of a Solomon Schechter school in the conservative movement. And so here's an example. I oversaw from preschool through 8th grade. In a preschool, one day, there was they were going to bring in a petting zoo to the preschool, as preschools do. And so the preschool director calls me on the phone and says, we're bringing in this petting zoo, and the teachers are concerned because one of the animals that they're bringing in is a pig. Can you have a pig in a Jewish school for a petting zoo? So I remembered that Rabbi Artson taught me, he said, you won't know every answer to every question when you get out in the field, but you will know 90% of the answers to the questions. And I thought, well, maybe this isn't the 10%. I don't remember. I spent years studying Talmud and codes, and I worked my tail. I don't remember one Gemara about pigs and petting zoos. And so I called another rabbi in the community, somebody that I felt like I could trust and wouldn't judge me for a stupid question. And I asked him, and he said, I don't know. I was like, geez, this is a real conundrum. But he said, I'll tell you one thing. As a rabbi, you have to think about it like this. Every decision you make it's as if it becomes headlines in the Jewish Journal. So if you're okay with the headlines, Rabbi Steinberg makes decision to have pig in the school, then go for it. If not, don't do it. That was actually quite a big burden, and I felt very alone in this. Like I could screw this up somehow. As an aside, I did permit the pig to come in. There's nothing against petting pigs. Pigs can be friends too. Is that okay, Rabbi? But it's an example of the kind of, I guess what I felt was loneliness in sort of making decisions. I didn't know how to navigate that. Now, this may not be everybody's experience, but it was mine. It's part of my story. The second thing about the loneliness is about personal observance. As Rabbi is symbolic exemplar, people look at how you practice your Judaism. There are laws and rituals to follow. And people want to know what you do. And so being a rabbi in a big synagogue and also in a big day school, like, I'm not known, but within like a 2-mile radius of where my neighborhood and my institution, I'm kind of like a celebrity. So like wherever I go, there's somebody there. So back in the days when Blockbuster existed, I would go to Blockbuster. And inevitably, every time I would see somebody that I knew. And I had to think about this. Like, can I rent that movie? Like, how does that look if I rent this movie? What are they going to think? The rabbi's watching this. And if you ask my wife, she'll tell you that I am a sucker for, like, all the B action movies. If it has Jason Statham in it kicking ass, I will watch it multiple times. And, like, I had to think about that. Like, what kind of movies can if I go to the supermarket and I roll up with something in my cart, are people going to question, oh, he's eating something that doesn't have a hechsher? And then you have to explain it. And one of my friends, David Glickman, who was a rabbi about my age, also in Dallas, said, now I'm a conservative rabbi. And conservative rabbis care about Jewish observance quite a bit. We follow halakha, Jewish law. And he said this thing about conservative rabbis is that we have in common something that no other rabbis have in common with Chabad, the ultra-Orthodox Chabad. We are way more observant than the congregations and communities we serve. The problem is we don't look like it. And so people don't totally get it. So they ask you, I was asked questions like, do you keep Shabbat? Do I keep Shabbat? What kind of question is that? And what they mean, if you continue the conversation, is, do you use electricity on Shabbat? And so here as a conservative rabbi, because everything has to be so complicated and gray, you get into this conversation and you're watching yourself and you find yourself sounding like you're like a philosopher from another solar system, that you have no idea how the world works. And so you end up asking this question back and you say, well, what is electricity exactly? And the person just wants to know, but you feel like you have to explain and teach all ends of this. Do you drive? Well, what is it that makes up driving on Shabbat? What is the symbolic representation? And you end up with these conversations that are very convoluted, and it feels like you're alone. You're having a conversation, and you're involved in some intellectual discussion that nobody knows else is involved in that. The third thing is, can you have friends as a rabbi? Harriet talked about this a little bit. Can you really have friends with your congregants? I guess you can have friends with your rabbinical school classmates. What can you really reveal about yourself? If you reveal your imperfections or your struggles, even with Judaism, you could be judged. You could lose your credibility. At least that's what I thought. And then people don't want to reveal things to you. They clean up for the rabbi when you come over. They dress up for you. They don't want you to know how they don't keep Shabbat or how they don't eat kosher, and they end up explaining, justifying their behavior a lot of times doing this, and there's an awkwardness. I know Rabbi Artson talks a lot about how we have to keep our friends from when we were before rabbis, but you get worked up, and I personally lost a lot of contact with some of those people. And I was in Dallas when I started, and Dallas is in the middle of nowhere. Dallas is an hour from Oklahoma. Okay, that's where Dallas is. It's in the center of the country. There's nothing close to Dallas. And so I couldn't really communicate with friends and family a lot of times about the stuff I was going with. And the last thing and I'll wrap up, is that, and I'm really concerned about this, is can a rabbi be friends with the colleagues? And right now, there's a major movement for rabbis to be more business-oriented, administrative. Rabbi as CEO. So you have these colleagues, you have people work for you, but can you really reveal and be yourself? And your authority, what I was taught is your authority as a rabbi is Torah. That's all you have. You're not a politician. You're not a scientist. Your authority is Torah, spirituality. But can you really be like that with somebody when you're the one who's making decisions about their salary? When you're the one negotiating contracts? When you're the one firing people? And I fired quite a few people. And it was very painful. I didn't always know how to navigate that as a rabbi. And so what ended up happening with all of these things is that my shame and my fraudulence caught up with me. And I found myself living a very divided life. I found myself on one hand playing a part and teaching things that I myself was unable to internalize. I knew it, but I had a really hard time living it. I didn't know how to combine my soul and my role. I mean, I knew it up here, but I was caught in a cycle of shame and isolation and loneliness. And when I came to Beit Tshuva, and this is why I mentioned the residents, I could be something else. I could be rabbi, I could wax rabbinic, but I could also make a dirty joke. I could also say something silly. I could show my imperfections. Thank you. And my soul and role slowly began to grow and emerge, and now I can talk like this openly, where I don't know that I could have talked like this a year ago. I might have wanted to perform and make it perfect. And so I'll just end with this. What I fear, I think what most of us fear, is to live in total isolation. To be dead while everyone else around you is alive. To not be able to connect. And that's what it was like for me. That's how I felt. I was surrounded by people, but utterly alone. And when I'm in that place, the initial human response, that yearning to connect, that's what I call prayer. It's a reaching out. It's an intention to connect and be fully me. And today, my life is prayer. My life is a prayer. It's all day, every day, in attempts to going back to my core, who I am, all of who I am, and reaching out to connect with others in love. So thank you for being here and listening to my story and sharing my story of my life. And it's now my honor to welcome up my teacher and Rabbi Artson, who trains rabbinic students, to come up and share a few words.
Thank you, friends, and thank you, Rabbi Steinberg, for your courage and your integrity and your openness. I don't know, having two rabbis talk in a row may well be my understanding of hell. So I'll try to at least make it short. I want to talk about what it means to live one life, but to live that life planted in the life you live. So the first story, a story many of you may know, this is an ancient rabbinic legend, about 1700 years old. God, having created the world, having created people, sets about scribbling what's going to become a Torah. And the angels say, who are you making that for? And God says, I'm making that for people. And the angels shudder and they say, you know what, the Torah, that's the most holy thing in the world. There's nothing as sacred as Torah. And you can't give that to them. Do you know what they're going to be like? They're going to lie, and they're going to deceive, and they're going to cheat, and they're going to steal, and they're going to kill each other and beat each other and rape each other, and they're going to disappoint themselves, and they're going to be disgraceful in the choices they make, they don't deserve your sacred wisdom. And so God says to the angels, why don't you open up the Torah and tell me some of what's in it? And they say, okay, see, right here it says, you shall not steal. And God said, who do you think needs that rule? Someone who steals or someone who doesn't? It says here, don't commit adultery. Who needs that rule? Someone who never cheats or someone who might? And the angels admit that the Torah is not meant for the perfect. It's meant for the brave. It's not for the perfect. It's for the brave. If you have the courage to live a life of truth, then you deserve to live a life of Torah. And the challenge, I think, that you so beautifully highlighted is that so many of us think that perfection means never fail. Perfection means never stumbling, never falling. That's not perfection. That just means you're not moving. If you stand still and you don't touch anything, nothing will break. But if you're moving through life and you're doing the best you can, things are going to break. Things are going to shatter. You're going to disappoint yourself. We all will do that. The difference is, can we live openly? Can we live honestly? Can we be all of who we are? That doesn't mean we justify every choice we make. It doesn't mean every choice we made was okay. It doesn't mean we don't have things to apologize for and to make right. It just means we're willing to stand in the sunlight and be all of who we are. Second story, one that I would imagine less of you know, it was news to me. So a group of us have started studying the Zohar, which is the core text of Jewish mysticism. If you read a page of Zohar a day, you can cover it in 5 years. I'm not encouraging you to run out and get the Zohar. It is a wacky and a wild book and a very wild ride. One of the things the Zohar talks about in the beginning section on Bereshit, on creation, the Zohar notices that God, when God begins to create on the first day, separates light from darkness. I assume you all know this from the book of Genesis. It's not till day 3 that God makes the sun and the moon and the stars. 4. Thank you. So you have 4 days of another imperfection. You have 4 days in which there's constant light, but it's not coming from the sun and the moon and the stars. What is that? The Zohar says that the world up until that day was pure chesed, pure bounty, pure love. And it was unsustainable. So that light had to be hidden away, and instead we now get light through things, through the stars, through the sun. But someday that primal light will again be revealed, and it will be revealed to the righteous, not to the perfect, not to the unblemished, but to the tzaddik, the one who is capable of honestly confronting their choices and of taking responsibility for those choices, of correcting what needs to be correcting, of shifting what needs to be correcting, of not blaming everyone but ourselves, but of saying, no, I am the captain of my soul. That's tzaddik. And there is a light inside each of us, hidden away, the Zohar says, that is that light. And the way you see it is you look in a person's eyes. And when you look in their eyes, you see a sparkle. You see a quality that's magical. That's where the light was hidden. It wasn't hidden away out there. It was hidden away in each of us. It was hidden in you. And the way we reveal that light is by stepping into the light. So I want to close with two observations. The Torah insists, the rabbis teach us, that God cannot abide in a place of untruth. Cannot abide in a place of untruth. If you're not willing to be open and honest, you can abide in that place, but God won't be there with you. And then you will be alone, and you will feel lonely. But once you step out into the light, once you risk looking for the light in others by sharing your truth and listening for theirs in a way that isn't of judgment, but is of love, that chesed meets chesed. That love brings out love. We all desperately need to live in a world in which we can be all of ourselves. And the only way to do that is when we start to do that. The great lie of the rabbinate is that you have to be a mask. You have some oppressive, imaginary figure of some stained glass voice and some pew-ridden life. And that perfect clergy person is toxic. Here's what the world needs. The world needs someone who lives Torah filtered through love. Someone who's able to bring wisdom to life because they don't have to hide anything. And so they can bring their pain and their imperfections into Torah. They can bring their rage and their disappointment into Torah. They can bring their joys and their giddiness and their thrills into Torah. And that Torah is a Torah Chaim, a Torah of life. So the last thing I want to say is there are indeed parts of you that you were artful at hiding. From me, from other teachers, I would imagine sometimes also from yourself. What you never were able to obscure was your deep goodness, your wisdom, your kindness. I thought of Paul as our cowboy rabbi. He kind of looks like an shucks guy who's like going to saddle up a horse and wrestle some cows until he starts talking. And he always said the wisest things, because the wisdom always came from that light within. It always came from a pure place of you. When I read his book, I called Stuart and I said, in all the years we've known each other, I have never told you you have to publish a book. But this one, you have to publish. Because there isn't a lie on any page, in any sentence, in any paragraph. I have never seen a book so completely transparent and real. It will change your life. Reading it changed mine. But when you have the courage to come out into the open, what you do is you bestow to the people around you permission to do the same. You gave us a great gift by coming out, by no longer hiding, and by modeling for us what it means to stand in the light. And for that, we are all in your debt.
What is the connection with Judaism that helps you to deal with your own shame and imperfection? What are the teachings that have helped you to get beyond shame and blame to connection?
All of them. It's an interesting question. It was 1987, and I was in a prison cell. My brother had sent me I asked him for a Hertz Chumash and a Silverman prayer book. And my brother's a Reformed rabbi. He sent me a Plough Torah and a Gates of Prayer. And I read the stories, and I thought about Abraham being our father. You know, it was a great example for me because he threw one kid out and almost killed the other. And then I really read Jacob's story, Jacob and Judah, which we're reading now. The story of Jacob being a con man, a liar, a cheat, a thief. Now that's not what the rabbis say in the Midrash, I know. They clean him up well. And that he had to have, in this week's Parsha, a wrestling match with whomever, himself, God. By the way, there's a great question asked people. Who saw God face to face? Most rabbis will tell you Moses, correct? There was another one, Jacob. It says it this week in the Parsha. I tricked a rabbi in prison about that. But it was this sense that to find out, to be able to change, you have to wrestle with yourself. And Judah for me is this great exemplar of doing a complete tshuva. Jacob to me never got there. When faced with letting his second brother become enslaved, he stood up and he was ready to kill Joseph. He was ready to do whatever it took to honor his promise to his father. And I cried at that moment because I remembered my own promise to my own father that I had thrown away and I had discarded. That basically I'd shit on. And that moment told me I didn't have to have shame and blame. That I just had to, I had to be a person, I had to do tshuva, and that would be enough.
I was sitting here racking my brain for a smart response. So you'd all think I'm smart and have a perfect answer. And I could come up with an easy one, which is the story of Rabbi. Because when you go to heaven, they won't ask you, were you like Moses? Were you like the great all-stars of the Jewish tradition? They'll ask you, were you like Zusia? Were you like yourself? But the truth is, for me, there are many great teachings, like what Rabbi would say, all of them. And I, can continue to cherry pick great teachings. But what I've learned is that insight and great teachings don't necessarily change me. I can have all the insight and intellectual acumen in the world. I can know the whole Torah backwards and forwards, but it won't really change the shame and blame that I had. I could teach all sorts of pearls of wisdom of Torah, but I still inside didn't necessarily internalize them. So what I would say, and it might come to no surprise, is the people that I spiritually counsel, the teachings that are the greatest are the teachings of practice and what we do. The wisdom of Judaism, for me, is that it is embodied, not just in what we think and what we believe, but in what we do and how we spend our day. And what I've learned is these spiritual practices are terribly important, critical for my survival, for the survival of my spirit. So I know what Judaism teaches is that each day I have to begin in meditation and prayer. And for me, that's setting my intentions as the kind of person that I am, remembering who I am, what I'm grateful for. and projecting the best sense of myself into the day that I have ahead. And then I can take the risk to be me, because I've intended in a certain way. And then after I've lived that day and I've done what I've done, I've gone through relationships and I've accomplished things, I look back on my day in prayer, in teshuvah, which is return, repentance, and I do an inventory, a cheshbon nefesh. And I look, did I hit the mark? Did I live up to my intentions? And if I didn't, then I have to make amends. And every day in Judaism we make tshuva. Every day we acknowledge that we're imperfect. We call out to God as God is the one who wants tshuva. If God's the one that wants tshuva, then God expects that we're going to make mistakes and make errors. And I can do something about that. And that's how I live my day. Constantly stopping, making intentions in prayer, and then looking back. Was I okay? Was I honest? Was I a good friend? Do I owe someone an apology? And for me, that embodiment of my intentions and my reflections is the greatest teaching of all as to how to live a spiritual life.
You want a third answer? Pardon me?
Maybe you don't have any change of way.
You should talk to my wife. So the great paradox of my life is that I grew up an atheist, and my mother is a devout atheist, a Freudian psychoanalyst, and thinks pretty certainly that religion is hogwash. She has a stronger term. And I would say the stronger term. And
you're a Beit Shuv, it's okay.
So I didn't discover God until college. And once I did, I was struck by the fact that I think most people underestimate God's love. We project onto God judgment and rigidity and scorn. We take our shame and we act as though God sees it and shares it, when in fact scriptures of all traditions keep coming back to love. God creates the world through love. God has an everlasting love. Years later, my mom asked me, Freudian analyst that she was, where I thought that came from, that conviction of mine, and I told her it came from her, which is a perfect rebellion. When I was a baby, before I knew I was hungry, you fed me. Before I knew I was soiled, you cleaned me. Before I knew I was lonely, you hugged me. You taught me that I'm worthy of love. You taught me that the universe is a compassionate place and that if you cry out, you'll be heard. That got reinforced by all kinds of scripture, but if I'm really honest with myself, I didn't learn that from the Torah. I learned that from living what my mother had given me as a child and returning to that fundamental truth. And I spend my life trying to model that for others. You are way more lovable than you know, and God loves you more than you can imagine. And when you know that you're loved and you know you can count on being loved, then you can risk facing your shortcomings and doing something about them.
I think both of you brought up some great points and brilliant and very, very poignant. And I think that, one of the things that we don't take as love is tochacha, rebuke, it says in the Torah. And I think this was the thing, in our conversations at times, Paul, that when somebody says to you, you're doing something wrong, and when I read Torah or I read Rabbi Heschel is the worst person for me to read because he disturbs my life. Everything he writes is like, oh shit, I'm not doing that either. But the thing is that for somebody, I mean, I'm blessed. I have a lot of people that tell me what I do wrong, often, daily, and it's a tremendous statement that I believe in you, and I believe and I know that you are more than the negativity you put out. That light that Rabbi Artson was talking about, that even though you're trying to hide it, I see it. And I've learned to take Torah like that. And I'm blessed because I'm a student of Rabbi Feinstein's, and he does that to me every week that I see him. Tells me what I do wrong, and it's just lovely. And I think that it's an important piece about what love is. If Torah is love, as you said, Rabbi Artson, then love is also instruction. And you know, I mean, we've gotten Rabbi Steinberg enlisted in this thing, so I'm going to try and enlist Rabbi Artson and all of you in this movement that Harriet started 30 years ago. And that is to put more tshuva in the world. That if we're willing to look at ourselves and say these 5 words, the 5 hardest words to put together. Oops, I made a mistake. Then we don't have to hide. And I have to tell you something, Paul, I was thinking about it, and I'm going to say this publicly because in 2 of the interventions I was a prime player. And the first time I know you hated me, pissed off. The second time, you weren't thrilled, and you knew that we were given, I represented a lifeline. The truth is that when we're in tshuva, there is no shame. There's not even blame. It's just being responsible. So, Rabbi Artson, I'm asking you to join this movement. And because you have such a loud voice and a strong voice and really an international voice, to make sure that there's not more people like Paul, rabbis, and not more people like me in 1986 that felt so scared that we had to hide. And we need you to join us because you have the platform. And letting people know that tshuva is love. So it said tshuva, right? Desires, wants, are tshuva. So as I turn it over to everybody else, you agree that Rabbi Artson would be a great spokesman person?
Okay, so I'm gonna start the process by doing tshuva. I want you to know that I ordained both of these people. Both of them, and I repent of it.
So you did change the way we got ordained after it.
I did, and more coming. But I want to say one serious point briefly before we open it up to you. The other thing I think is really essential to say is that you never know what's a failure and what's a success until the story's over. The 3 times in my life where I professionally set out to achieve a specific thing, I thank God every day I failed in all 3 of them. And they were bitter failures. I didn't get into the school I wanted, I didn't get the job I wanted, that I couldn't go for the position I wanted. And those were really hard to deal with, and thank God I didn't. Because I would have been a miserably unhappy lawyer and not very good at it. And because the pulpit that I was going for would have killed my soul. And the job I wanted was all about ego. And it was the process of being denied all 3 of those things that set me on a path of healing and of joy. So you never know what's your failure and what's your triumph until you look back a long time afterwards, and it's not what you think it is when you're going through it.
Amen.
Amen.
Questions?
Wow.
Comments? Anything? Nothing?
That 3 wise men.
I never saw this many Jews so quiet.
I think one more Jew needs to be quiet to let something happen.
If you guys would be so kind to step up to the mics when you do eventually get around to asking the questions, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Good evening, thank you guys. When I heard the topic tonight, I was really intrigued. And I'd like to know, it's kind of, I guess, about human fallibility and how your mistakes that you've made have strengthened you as a leader and as a teacher. And maybe if you ever feel that your mistakes kind of compromise you as a teacher and a leader.
You need a minute? I think all of my mistakes have made me a great teacher. I mean, I have what's called the dirty spirituality. I am not, I'm not one of the, I'm not really brilliant. I'm not as learned as Paul or Brad or many people. I came later to this than Paul did. And my mistakes, and even today my mistakes, they keep me learning and seeking more and doing more. So for me, meditation is study. And a lot of my prayers, it comes through study. I learned that from Rabbi Schulweiss and Rabbi Feinstein. And so my mistakes have kept me going to constantly refine myself. And help me to help others refine themselves. Sometimes my mistakes people use, and they use them as ways to prove that nothing works. Many times people have said, see, a leopard doesn't change its spots. And that may be true for a leopard, it's just not true for humans. So for me, the idea of what my mistakes do is that I'm kind of out on Front Street. And everybody sees my mistakes. And I have a plethora of people here, residents, staff, alumni, donors, board members, that they see my mistakes, they see my successes. And I think what it does for everybody is it gives them, A, knowledge that they can make mistakes, but B, more importantly, it allows me to never buy my own press, which for a rabbi is really important. I'll give you a story. People come up to me and they say, this was the best Shabbos ever. My first thought is, what was wrong with last week?
Yeah, right.
And my second thought is, wow, somebody really got something. They were moved. So for me, the mistakes, they just help me keep learning and growing and remembering what Rabbi Artson said. A tzaddik is somebody who lives life in truth and openly. And I'm not a tzaddik, I'm just working along that path.
That's a great question, by the way. Thank you for that. I want to sort of echo something that Rabbi Artson said a minute ago, which is that my mistakes don't necessarily have to define my whole life. So, like, I have a past, and I made a lot of mistakes. I mean, I make 1,000 mistakes every day, but I made some big ones in the past. And I can't change that. I can't change the data of my history. But I can change the meaning of it by how the story continues to unfold. And those mistakes can become the stepping stones to greater capacity, to greater compassion, to greater connectivity, and to greater love. And I think in that way, my mistakes serve as my teachings. I think I'm here on this planet, and what am I here to do as a human being ultimately? I believe I'm here to learn. I'm here to learn of the wonder of God's world, and I'm here to reflect it and bear witness and reflect it back and reflect it out in the light that Rabbi Artson talked about. And so I have to be clear about what that is. And my mistakes are my opportunities to learn and to hone and calibrate my spirit toward those things. How does it hinder? I don't know that it hinders me, but sometimes when I'm utterly honest about my mistakes, I do wonder if that brings me closer to people or whether it alienates me from people. I don't always know, but I believe that most of the time, it helps people to see my authenticity through my sincerity as a human being, because I think ultimately it gives them permission and invites them to open up to their own mistakes as well, and to see this life as the school that it is. In the Yom Kippur liturgy, we refer to the world as Yeshiva Shel Mata, the schoolhouse below. And I think if we can see the world that way and see ourselves as students constantly learning, I think that's deeply humbling and helpful in understanding what mistakes mean to us.
First I want to say thank you. What a deep topic, I would say. I'm in rabbinical school, and so I was wondering, both from a student perspective and a faculty perspective, what I sort of heard was people get trapped in this role, and the role gets constructed over time. And I would imagine where that starts is school, like in your story, Paul. And so I wondered what role you all thought seminaries play in the potential split in the role of the rabbi. I don't know if that's a clear, I don't know if it's a clear question, but.
The answer that I'm about to give is reflective only of me. Don't generalize from my opinions. I'm pretty idiosyncratic. I think it has nothing to do with the seminaries. The really great teachers are the same in private as they are in public. So our founding president, David Lieber, one of the real saints. You met him in the supermarket or the gym or his boardroom or at a luncheon. He was the same human being. My wife and friends tell me that I have no boundaries. I'm the same guy everywhere. I think people come to the rabbinical school thinking they have to put on a role. the language you used as dangerous language. Being a rabbi isn't assuming a role. It's not something you put on and take off. Okay? And so I think a combination of our culture at large, by which I mean general culture, which from early on tells you people will love you more if you snip that off, cut that back, trim it down, lose 15, stand taller, change the color of your hair, change the shape of your nose, wear something different. Like there's no end to the way we internalize the message that we're unworthy of respect or affection unless we buy in to all of these modifications, because someone else is sitting in judgment. And that coupled with our own sense of our own vulnerability. And the first response to vulnerability is I need to hide it. And it's the wrong response. The way to be invulnerable, I learn from my dog every day, right? So Molly, when you take her to the dog park, and she gets into a tussle with a dog that's tougher than she thought, what does she do? She sticks her neck out. She doesn't hide her vulnerability, she flaunts it, right? What if we did that, right? If I have some vulnerability, let's meet in that vulnerability. Then I have no weakness anymore. You already know it, and you're primed to respond to my revealing my vulnerability by revealing your compassion. So I think it's too easy to blame the seminaries or to blame the grade structure or to blame the class. I think we come primed to hide our vulnerabilities and already taught that we need to mask who we really are in order to achieve, and both messages are dead wrong. Now, I can't speak for other seminaries, but I hope that it is true that at ours, there are enough models of people who are authentically themselves in public and in private, that people, when they're ready to take in that message, have people who they can see it in. But you have to be ready to step into the light.
Can I argue with you a little bit? I want to agree with part of what you said, and I want to disagree. And this says nothing of you, by the way, as my dean and teacher. By the way, when I entered rabbinical school during orientation, Rabbi Artson said to the incoming class, and I think this is indicative of him as a human being, and also the way in which he runs the rabbinical school, but he told us that he loved us. And I don't know that every dean says that to the incoming class of rabbinical students. That says a lot. I think, though, what your question is not necessarily, the part that I agree is that I don't think it's necessarily seminaries, but I think it's indicative of a larger structure of how higher education, in a way, works, of which the seminaries are a part of. They are. There is an interview process. There are essays that you write. There is a selection process. And when you enter into the seminary, you're confronted with professors who expect certain standards of you. Whether those are explicit or implicit, you're expected to know a vast body of knowledge. You're expected to represent a particular tradition. And where it gets messy is not necessarily in those expectations, because those are reasonable, but where it gets messy is in the psychology of each of the people that enter into the seminary. And the seminary doesn't do, as far as I know, psychological examination of the people that enter it. So my story is my story. I came with my own narrative of what it meant to be a rabbi, and I projected that into all of the systems that I encountered as I entered rabbinical school. I projected it into my fellow classmates. And there isn't entirely, nor maybe can there ever be, a way to process all that as you go through. And so what we enter with, to a certain extent, is going to stay with us. Maybe there could be a process where students in rabbinical school, but this could also, by the way, be in medical school. It could be any higher elite, it could be in law school kind of educational system where the person that is ultimately going to be produced, the professional, has a certain level of symbolic expectation as a leader or an expert. Maybe there could be a process where we unpack some of the things that we ourselves are dealing with. I don't know. This is a sort of half-baked answer, but I wouldn't entirely say that it's not about the seminary.
So let me, I agree with what you said, 100%. Let me add one additional level. One of the things we try to do to create a safe space for people to be able to break themselves down and break themselves open is Rabbi and I have been working for many years towards this vision. This year we finally were able to start implementing it, where our Mashpia Ruchani leads each class in what we call holy conversation, where she and they meet, each class meets separately, but they have a regularly scheduled session just for honest self-contemplation and for honest thinking through. That we didn't used to have, and I don't know of any other rabbinical school that has that systematized through the program. So, thank you to Reb Mimi for the courage to make that dream a reality. But that wasn't there when either of you guys were in the program. What is that also, in addition to that, I and the other deans routinely say to the students, come set up a monthly meeting. No agenda, just come to talk. And I'll sit in silence until the student has something to talk about. But there are students who blow that off, and there are students who come in once a month, and we have incredible open conversations about whatever's on their mind and in their heart. I think that's crucial, because if you don't have someone who can be your Rebbe in that way, who you can be safe and transparent with, then it's hard to be safe and transparent with yourself, and then it's hard to learn how to do that for other people.
One more, I'll take one more, and then we're going to sign books, yes?
Okay.
Jared.
Well, so I've had some brief conversations with you, Paul, about it, about Kabbalah, and I really like what you have to say about the Zohar, and I think the whole thing about light and dark and just kind of the dichotomous nature of existence seems to be a very prevalent topic here. And I really appreciate how Beit Shuva kind of teaches us to embrace both. So I guess I'm trying to frame this not so much as a question, just sort of a topic for discussion. Kabbalah is something that I notice in the world seems many times almost be treated as something separate from Judaism. But it's also something that for me makes Judaism very appealing on a whole new level. Just as my experience here, because I had kind of the opposite experience of you, which is my parents raised me in a conservative synagogue, wherever, as soon as I was bar mitzvah, atheist. So I feel like that anymore. But so I guess I was just kind of wondering, since I don't think there's a lot of talk about it, various applications and maybe how y'all as rabbis feel about Kabbalistic practices and applications.
Okay, I'll start. That was a good thing. Thanks, Jared. For me, when I look to my spirituality, when I need my healing, my insight, I turn to Kabbalah and I turn to Hasidism, which is really an outgrowth of Kabbalah. I understand Kabbalah to be sort of cosmology of understanding how the universe works in divided parts, but Hasidism for me kind of psychologizes it, makes it human. I think one thing we have to understand is that Kabbalah was normative for a long time in Judaism. And there were certain traumas that happened in history that pushed it undercover. Not sure, I think that we could do more with this teaching of the different elements of the soul, the different elements of the universe, and one in which we can learn that the universe is inherently constructed in a way that is flawed. I mean, I think that's in concert with all that we've been talking about. Isaac Luria taught that the world was created broken into shattered vessels, affixed to pieces of light, and that's what each of us are. And our work is to find our own healing within ourselves, and the magic of that is that when we find our own healing within ourselves, we end up affixing to other shards and pieces of light and healing the world around us. And I think that that offers an incredible worldview and personal view of healing that we could use more of.
Thank you for your question. The only thing I would add to what Rabbi Steinberg said is that Kabbalah can be a trap, just like anything can be a trap. I have heard spiritual people say incredibly stupid things. Right? And incredibly hurtful things. So if you turn to Kabbalah thinking, okay, finally here's the stuff that's got all the goods, it will betray you just like everything else. Right? What always matters is the heart you bring to it. Right? What I love about Zohar is it's the book of yearning. Right? It's the book not of a dispassionate God who can't be bothered. It's a God who's broken, and a God who is struggling for wholeness and knows that wholeness comes out of love, and it comes out of hurt, and it comes out of striving, and it comes out of not giving up. And that vision of God speaks very powerfully to me. Those of my students in the room know that I teach a kind of theology called process theology. It's the one book you can't buy tonight, but I'm not bitter about that. Others would be, but I rise above it.
I know you didn't send that.
I have no ego. So, for me, the minute I approach Kabbalah and ask, is this a fact? Is this literally true? It dies, and it's still on the table. But if I take it to be a poetic system that takes the yearning and the brokenness in my heart and in the world and gives it poetry so that you can look at it and cry with it and laugh with it and sing with it, I don't know any poetic system more potent. And so, look, the sterile kind of Judaism that many of us are recovering from, we're recovering from. And we have something to bring back into the world, which is that doesn't come from the sources of Judaism. It comes from having been dried out and emptied by the institutions we built. And so if we can let the life of Jewish holiness, the holiness that flows through the bloody, murky stories of Torah and the pulsing stories of Midrash and the arguments of Talmud and the living of the prophets and the passion for justice and the yearning and the erotic charge of the Zohar, we can let that wash our synagogues so that they're filthy clean with life again, then we will have done a service for the world.
So Rabbi Heschel says that each of us are divine needs and reminders of God. And I was reading we studied a piece on Shabbos. I do a Heschel study at 7:15 every Shabbos morning. And the piece we were reading is that he said that revelation is really God reaching to us. So whether it's through Kabbalah, through Torah, through Talmud, through prayer, through Nevi'im or Ketuvim. But most of all, what I want to thank both of you for this evening, and Paul will be available to sign his books, and Rabbi Artson will give you a rain check, or tell you, actually, Stuart Matlins will tell you where to buy Rabbi Artson's books. I want to thank you both for the revelation that you both brought here tonight, both of you brought here tonight, and for the reaching to all of us, from your God place, from your light, from your dark, from the place of sort of bringing the split together, and that